Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a pumpkin purse. It measures in at 8.5 by 7 with a 5-inch depth. And you can make this bag with the face or without the face. It's a super fun project for Halloween, and if you're new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, don't forget to grab the PDF pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need a 1/2 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a very lightweight leather or vinyl. I'm actually going to be using a synthetic leather. It worked very nice, it's lightweight, and once you start stacking all those layers together at the end, it works well and doesn't jam up the sewing machine. But like always, test different fabrics and find something that's going to work for you. You'll need a 1/4 yard for your secondary fabric. This is going to be used for the lining on the inside of the bag. I'm going to be using a lightweight nylon. It worked very well, it's durable, and it looks good. You'll need a 1/4 yard of cardboard or chipboard. I actually went with the chipboard. It was 55 point. It worked very well and gave nice structure to the pumpkin. This material is definitely needed because this is how you get that structure of the pumpkin. So if you're looking for what I use, just remember it's a chipboard and it was a 55 point. You'll need a 1/4 yard of interfacing or foam. This is optional, but what we're going to be doing is putting this on the pumpkin, and when we add our stitches across, it'll give a 3D puffiness to the pumpkin, similar to a puffer jacket. Again, it is optional. If you don't want to add this, you don't need to. You'll need one 10-inch zipper, and you can pretty much use any style of zipper for this project. I'll be cutting mine from a zipper roll. It's a great way to go. You minimize the waste and you can get precise cuts. You'll need 2 yards of webbing or leather strap. We're going to be using this for the shoulder strap, and you can get this in any width you would like. It really comes down to the preference. I'll be making mine at 3/4 of an inch, but I'm also going to be showing you how to make the strap out of your main fabric. In the hardware going along with the strap, you'll need 2 lobster clasps, 2 D-rings, and 1 strap slider. The biggest thing about these is that you want them to match the width of your webbing. I'll be making my strap at 3/4 of an inch, so all my hardware is going to be 3/4 of an inch width. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. The pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. Before you tape your pattern together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. And from here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. And after cutting out all of your fabric, you should end up with 2 pumpkin main panels cut out of your main fabric, 2 pumpkin inside panels cut out of your main fabric. And remember, we're also cutting out the inside oval. 4 pumpkin lining cardboard panels, 2 cut out of your secondary fabric and 2 cut out of your cardboard or chipboard. 4 pumpkin main cardboard panels, 2 cut out of your cardboard or chipboard, and 2 cut out of your foam or interfacing. The foam interfacing panels are optional. If you don't want to add this look to the bag, you don't need to cut these panels out. But we'll get more into that once we start making the bag. 2 bag bottom side panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric. 4 bag zipper side panels, 2 cut out of your secondary fabric and 2 cut out of your main fabric. For the pumpkin face panels, you'll need 2 to 4 eyes, 1 to 2 noses, and 1 to 2 mouths. This depends on if you're adding a face to both sides of the bag, and again, it is optional. You don't need to add the face at all if you don't want to. I'm also going to be using a thicker leather for these panels so it stands out against the bag material. And lastly, 2 pumpkin stem panels. I'll be using the same fabric I'm using for the face. Moving on to construction, we're going to start with the pumpkin main cardboard panels. Separate the cardboard from the interfacing using the pattern, locate the top edge. Make sure this side is facing away from you, and then we're going to place the interfacing on top of the cardboard. I am using adhesive interfacing, so I'm going to use an iron to press it down. If you don't have adhesive interfacing or foam, you can also secure it down with glue. I actually used both the adhesive and the glue because you really don't want these layers to be shifting around. For the moment, you can place 1 cardboard panel off to the side and grab the pumpkin main panels. Since we're only working on one side to start, we can also place one of the pumpkin main panels off to the side. We're going to be adding this panel to the interfacing side, and to do this, we'll be using glue. If you are using a leather-based material, I recommend using leather glue. Flip the pumpkin main panel to the wrong side and apply your glue in the center, leaving the outside edges unglued. Using the pattern, locate the cardboard placement guide and also the fold allowance. This is where we're going to be placing the main cardboard panel within the main pumpkin panel. And we're placing the interfacing side to the wrong side of the main fabric. Remember to double check and make sure that you have the top side lined up with the top side. From here, I'm going to snip each one of the indentions to make it easier to fold that leather over the cardboard. After making your snips, apply glue to the fold allowance and fold it over the cardboard. And for this step, I do recommend using a fast setting glue so you don't have to sit there and hold it for a long time. And this is why I recommend using a thinner leather or vinyl, because it makes it a lot easier rolling that fabric over the cardboard. So just take your time and continue all the way around the outside edge. If you are wondering what type of glue I'm just using a standard super glue. Once you finished up, we're going to flip it over to the right side and double check the work. If done correctly, you should have nice round edges and see the shape of the pumpkin. If you are using a thicker material, you may need to trim a little bulk to really round those edges out. Once you're satisfied with the first one, we're going to repeat the step one more time for the second set of panels. The goal is to get these looking as identical as possible. After gluing, I also sat a weight on top of mine with the cardboard side facing down. This helped the glue set deeper into the fabric and pushed all those layers together. If you're still having an issue with the rounded areas, I do recommend looking into a different fabric because if it is too thick, it's very hard to get it perfectly round. I will link the faux leather I'm using in the video below. It was actually really easy to use and it also feels very close to leather. But anyways, moving on, grab the pumpkin main panel and locate the stitch guides. And what we're going to do is transfer these stitch guides onto our main pumpkin panels. Also, feel free to add more than 4 or make your own design. When it comes to transferring them, I do recommend using a pencil or chalk, something that you can wash away after you place your stitch. This way you can draw them out, kind of get a feel for how they look, and erase them and move them if you need to. This stitch is a big decorative aspect of the bag, so you really want to get it right or it's going to look really off if the stitches are not lined up correctly. But once you're happy with the placement, we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and add the stitch. I do recommend using a heavyweight thread so that way it stands out and looks really nice. It's also very important to do these in one go without starting or stopping. This will keep the stitches uniform and the lines straight. It's kind of hard to tell, but after adding the stitches, you can really see that center interfacing panel push out, give it a more three-dimensional feel. Also, the thicker you make that interfacing foam layer, the more it's going to push out. The only downside to that is if you add too many layers, it might get too thick to sew through, but if you have an industrial sewing machine, you should be totally fine. Next, we're going to be adding the face, so grab all of the face panels. We'll be adding the eyes, nose, and mouth. I'm only adding the face to one side of the bag, but feel free to add it to both. When it comes to the placement, you can realistically place it wherever you want, or you can reference the pattern to make sure it's lined up in the center and symmetrical. You can also change the look of the face too. I went with more of the generic style, so feel free to switch it up, or you can even add 2 different faces to both sides. Before we jump over to stitching, it's best to glue the face down so that way it's not moving around as we're stitching. I'm just using a standard super glue and you only need a little bit. It makes it so much easier when you're sewing shapes like this. Once you're ready, bring it over to the sewing machine and stitch around the outside edge of each one of the shapes. I recommend using an edge presser foot and also a thicker thread so that way it matches the thread on the pumpkin. If this is your first time sewing shapes like this, just take your time and try to make it as neat as possible. As you can see, mine didn't turn out totally perfect. It's very hard to get it perfect when you're working with a standard sewing machine. That's why using an edge presser foot and matching your thread color with your leather color help hide any imperfections. Also, if you don't like the way it turned out, you can always de-thread the face and try it again. But that's going to complete both of the outside pumpkin panels, so for the moment we can place them off to the side and grab the pumpkin lining cardboard panels and also the pumpkin stem panels. Separate the lining from the cardboard panels. Using the pattern, locate the pumpkin stem placement guide, and this will be the top edge of the panel. The placement guide is a small rectangle, and this is where the bottom of the stem is going to line up on the cardboard panel. There's also a second placement guide on the stem panel, and this is where the top edge is going to go through the stem. And you don't have to get this placement perfect. You can play around with it and move it where you would like. The further you move it up, the more it's going to stick out. Next, we're going to grab the secondary fabric panels and place the wrong side of the fabric to the cardboard. Make sure you have the top edge lined up with the top edge and the bottom with the bottom. It can be pretty tricky to cut these perfectly, so if they hang off the edge a little bit, you can always trim that up in later steps. Once you have everything lined up, we're going to add a stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as you can to that edge. Repeat the stitch for both lining panels, and it's also a good time to practice sewing those curves for when we take it to the outside panels in future steps. And after finishing up, double check, make sure all the layers got sewn together. I actually glued these layers together before I started to stitch, but I realized that the glue seeped through the fabric, so I don't recommend doing this if you're using a nylon material for the lining. But the main goal here is just to cover the cardboard with the lining material so that way you don't see it on the inside of the bag. So if your stitches are not perfect, that's totally fine because you're not going to be seeing them in the end product. Since this is going to be the inside of the bag, you can also add pockets to both of these panels. It's totally optional, but if you do want to add them, you're going to want to add them at this step. Next, we're going to grab the outside pumpkin panels from the previous step, flip both of these panels over to the wrong side, and place the lining panels directly in the center with cardboard sides together. And to keep these 2 layers together, we'll be using super glue. So add a good amount to the cardboard side and place the 2 panels together. Before allowing it to dry, make sure the 2 sides are lined up perfectly, and a good way to do this is use the stem as a reference. It should be lined up in the center on the top edge. Then go ahead and repeat this process for the second 2 panels. Once you have both panels glued down, we can set them off to the side to dry. Moving on to the next step, grab your bag zipper side panels, lay them out with right sides facing up. Along with the panels, grab your 10 to 12 inch zipper, and for the zipper, it just has to be longer than the width of the panels, because we're going to be sewing through the zipper in future steps. To start, we only need 1 main fabric and 1 secondary fabric panel, so the other 2 we can place off to the side. Using the pattern, locate the zipper edge, and this is where we're going to be placing the zipper. So place the wrong side of the zipper to the right side of the secondary fabric, and the right side of the zipper to the right side of the main fabric, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, move the panels back so the wrong sides are together, place a few pins, and make sure the outside edges are lined up. Grab the 2 remaining zipper panels and place them on the opposite side of the zipper, with the right side of the secondary fabric to the wrong side of the zipper and the right side of the main fabric to the right side of the zipper, lining up both sides, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, pull the panels away from the zipper with wrong sides together, place a few pins. Once you have the outside edges lined up and pinned down, we're going to add a top stitch to both sides of the zipper. At this point, the zipper assembly is complete, and before moving on to the next step, you're going to want to make sure you add your zipper chain if you're cutting your zipper from a zipper roll. For this next step, we're going to grab 2 D-rings. Mine are 3/4 of an inch width, because this is the size strap I'm going to be using. We'll be attaching these at both ends of the zipper, and to attach them, you have a few different options. You can use webbing, a leather strip, or even make your own. I typically use webbing, but since we're using a leather style material, I ended up making my own. And all you have to do is cut a small rectangle, roll the sides in, and add a stitch to both sides. If you choose to make them, I recommend making them at least 3 to 4 inches long and the width of your hardware. Since I'm using 3/4 inch hardware, I made my straps 3/4 inch. Feed the strap through the D-ring and place them directly on top of the zipper. When it comes to the placement, you want at least a 1/4 inch hanging past the edge of the zipper panel. You also want to mirror the placement on the opposite side so when you're wearing the bag, it's not offset. And from here, we're going to grab the bag bottom side panels, separate the secondary fabric from the main fabric layer, and what we're going to do is sandwich the zipper assembly in between both of these panels with right sides together. If the zipper assembly was sewn at the correct seam allowance, then it should be the same width as the bottom side panels. If you are using a heavier duty wide zipper, then you may need to trim the ends of the bottom side panel to match the zipper panel assembly. And trimming the sides to match won't affect any future steps. Line up all the layers on the side, place a few pins, then we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Line up all the layers and place a few pins. Once everything is pinned down and ready to go, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along both of those sides. Flip the right sides out, and it's very important you stitch at exactly a 1/4 inch or else the outside panel won't line up in future steps. So you may want to double check that before moving on. For this next step, we're going to be adding a top stitch to both sides, and to do this, you'll want to pull the bottom side panels away from the zipper assembly. Place a pin, repeat this for the opposite side, and add a top stitch to both sides. This stitch can get pretty bulky, so just take your time as you're sewing. After finishing up the top stitch, I like to place pins along that bottom panel to line up both the secondary and the main fabric layers. This will make it easier in the next step. In the next step, we're going to grab the pumpkin inside panels, separate the 2 layers, and using the pattern, locate the top edge. And this is the edge that's going to be on the zipper assembly side. Before pinning these 2 panels together, the best thing to do is to mark the centers on both the inside panels and the side panel assembly. Then we're going to flip the right sides out for the side panel assembly. Inline the top edge of the inside panel up with the zipper side of the side panel assembly with right sides together. Flip the side panel assembly around to the opposite side and pin the second inside panel with right sides together. And this is what I was talking about in the previous step. If the side panel assembly was sewn correctly, then the circumference of the outside edge should match the inside panel. This stitch is also a lot easier the more pins you add. So from here, we're going to stitch all the way around both sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I also found it to be easier by moving the base of the sewing machine so that way you can sew it in a circle. After finishing up the stitch, double check both sides, make sure all the layers got stitched together, including that secondary fabric layer. If you missed any spots, you can always go back and add a spot stitch to that area that the layers were missed. This is another step you want to be very precise with the 1/4 inch seam allowance because it's going to help when we're adding the face panels in future steps. But before we add the face panels, we're going to clean up these raw edges by adding double fold bias tape. There's a few different ways you can do this, and I'm going to be walking you through each one. The first method is using a bias tape making kit. In this technique, you make your own double-sided bias tape to the size and fabric you want to use. All you do is cut your strips, feed it through your folder, and press it when it comes out the folder. It's very easy to do, and you get to customize the bias tape to your exact measurements. The second technique is using a double fold bias tape binder. This is the most efficient technique. You cut your strips, feed it through your binder, and sew it directly to your raw edge. And the last technique is using pre-made double fold bias tape. You are limited to colors, but it's very easy to use. You fold it over the edge and stitch it down. and you want to make sure you apply it all the way around the outside edge. And I'm using the bias tape attachment. This is a great way to go if you plan on making a lot of bags. It gives me perfect bias tape every time, and then I also get to match the fabric on the inside so it looks very nice. Another thing it does that I really like is that it pops out the corners and just overall makes it look a lot more full. And this is an optional step. If you don't want to add the bias tape, you don't have to, but if you plan on making these bags to sell, I highly recommend adding it, because it adds extra durability and looks really professional. Now that the side panel assembly is complete, we can grab both of the face panels, and what we're going to be doing is sewing these to the inside panel. So make sure you have the top and bottom edges lined up. If everything was sewn correctly, then the inside panel should line up fairly close to the outside edge of the face panel. Before we start sewing, we're going to use super glue to attach these panels to make sure they're lined up as we're sewing. And if you want, you can glue that entire inside panel down so it sits flat on the face panel. If for some reason your inside panel is a little bit large and it doesn't fit right with the face panel, you can always trim it down to match the face panel. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky when you're working with fabric like this to get a precise cut when you're cutting the panels out. But it's an easy fix, and you can always do it after you sew the panel on. Once you have the first side glued on, flip it around, look at it from the front, make sure everything is lined up and looking correct. For this stitch, we're going to be stitching all the way around the outside edge of the pumpkin. Now the thing is, you can glue the second panel on before you start sewing, but I find it's easiest to sew the first one without the second face panel on, and then you glue the second face panel on and sew the second face panel. It just gives you a little bit more room to work with when you're sewing the first face panel on. So from here, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge, and it can be fairly bulky depending on what type of fabric you're working with, so just take your time, go slow, and try to make it as neat as possible. Also, you have to stitch with the face side pointed down, so the bobbin thread is going to be on the right side. So before you start sewing, make sure you switch out the bobbin thread for the main thread you want on the right side. I used the heavyweight thread in previous steps, so what I did was added that heavyweight thread to my bobbin, and then I started stitching. And the biggest thing here is remember to sew through both of the inside panel and the face panel layers. Like I said, this stitch is fairly tricky. If you don't get it right the first time, you can dethread it and try again, but it does take practice, so I do recommend cutting out sample pieces and practicing on those before you add this stitch. Because the trick is to try to do it all in one stitch, so that way you don't start and stop and add jagged points along the edge. And depending on what type of machine you're using, it's best to use a heavyweight needle so that way you don't break it when you're sewing through all the layers. The next trick I want to show you is to clean up the edge of the inside panel, because that will be a raw edge on the inside. Since we are using leather or vinyl, an easy way to fix that is to use edge coat. I've tested this on both materials and it works great. You're going to want to find one that matches the color of your fabric. All you need to do is use a fine tip brush or something like that and just dab it along the raw edge of the leather or vinyl. You only want to cover that raw edge, so you don't want to get it on the outside fabric or else it will stain. The leather I'm using is fairly thin, so I'm not going to be adding it, but it's a great way to go to really finish off the bag and make it look nice. Other than that, the bag construction is complete, so for the moment we can place it off to the side and cut 1.5 to 2 yard strip of your leather or vinyl material. We're going to be using this to make the strap. Typically I use webbing, but I have enough of this material left over to make the strap, and I'm going to be walking you through how to do that. So you're going to want to fold it in half. Since I'm using 3/4 inch hardware, I want my strip to be wider than the hardware because we're going to be rolling the opposite side inward, and that will decrease the size of the strap to match the size of the hardware. So if you're using wider hardware, then you're going to need to cut a wider strip. And don't worry, if you do cut it too wide, you can always trim it down after you sew the first side. But anyways, from here, we're going to start by sewing the rolled edge side of the strip. For the best results, I do recommend using an edge presser foot. After stitching the first side, we're going to move to the opposite side, roll the edges inward so the right sides are together. Since this fabric is on the thicker side, it's hard to pin, so I actually like to sew this as I go. And that means I start at one end, roll the edges inward, sew a little bit, and then keep rolling the edges inward as I go. And before you start sewing, it's best to double check the width with your hardware, because you can always quickly trim it down to size at this point. Once you're satisfied with the width, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew the opposite side. And you're probably going to want to use a heavier weight needle when you're sewing through this many layers of fabric. And just like that, the strap is complete and ready for hardware. So if you do have extra fabric laying around from the project, it's really nice to do it this way because it will match your bag. Next, we're going to be adding the hardware to the strap, so we're going to be adding 2 lobster clasps and 1 strap slider. Start by adding the strap slider and slide it down about 1 to 2 feet. Leave a little bit of slack in the opening, add your lobster clasp, then we're going to take that end and feed it back through the bottom side of the strap slider. Pull the slack out so you have room to sew, and we're not going to be rolling the end over twice because it's fairly thick, so we're just going to be laying it flat. Move to the opposite end of the strap and add the second lobster clasp. Roll the strap end over once and pin it down. Typically I'd roll the ends over twice and add a stitch, but for this one it's too thick, so what I'm going to be doing is adding a zigzag stitch directly on top of the edge. And I like to go back and forth a few times because the strap is going to take a lot of strain, so you really want to lock it down. I also went with a wider zigzag stitch so it covered up that raw edge and makes it look clean. And real quick, if you didn't make the strap, if you're using webbing, you're going to add the hardware the same exact way. But usually with the webbing, it's not as thick, so you can roll the ends over twice to get a nice clean edge and use a straight stitch. Now that the strap is complete, we can grab the bag and clip the lobster clasps to the D-rings. At this point, you can try on the bag, see how it fits, and if you need to make any adjustments to the strap, all you have to do is de-thread one side, trim it down, and re-stitch the lobster clasp back on. That's why I always recommend to make the strap a little bit bigger, because you can always trim it back and resize it. But since it's an adjustable strap, you should be good to go either way. Now that the bag is complete, you can get a look at it, and it's very easy to change up the width. If you plan on making another one and you wanted a different size, all you have to do is add or subtract to the width of the side panels, and the same goes for the face panels. You can make this larger by cutting those panels bigger, but you're going to have to also change the inside panel to match. The biggest thing is matching the circumference of the inside panel with the side panel assembly. And if you do end up making any of these changes to the panel sizes, the construction process will be the exact same. But like always, get creative, have some fun with it, and make a bag that fits your style. And there you have it, your pumpkin purse is complete. Hopefully yours turned out as good as mine did. It is a little bit tricky of a project when you're working with the cardboard and the foam. With all those layers combined, it can get a little bit bulky. So if you're having an issue with that, I definitely recommend finding a thinner fabric. The vinyl I have linked below looks like leather, it feels like leather, and it works very nice. But like always, I'd love to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing, and until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.